I'll give you a couple more minutes for that, like 1 or 2. Because as we talk about comparisons today, as we're thinking about neurotransmitters that we're using in different parts of the nervous system, it's going to be important that we can locate ourselves among all these branches. Otherwise, when I ask you about specific parts and how they're associated, it'll be a big question mark. All right, I'm going to draw it with you now. So when we're thinking about the nervous system, we know that we're talking about stuff coming into the central nervous system and going out through the peripheral nervous system when we're talking about these different divisions and branches. Okay, so that's just context for what we're doing. Okay. So the first part that we're dividing into, we're figuring out whether we're going into the central nervous system or whether we're coming out of the central nervous system. And we're going to go out of it over here. Okay. So this is where we have our compare contrast between afferent and efferent. So efferent, I think, is the easier one to remember because it has the word effect practically in it. Okay, so our efferent part are when we're going out and doing effects on the body, efferent. Which means that on the other side, that's where our afferent nerves have to go. So these are our sensory nerves. Okay, so anything that you're sensing out in the world coming in is going to be riding on an afferent nerve. So that's whether you're smelling, whether you're hearing, whether you're touching, whether you're sensing a temperature, whether you're sensing a heart rate, a blood pressure, anything that you're sensing and you're bringing information back to the brain or the spinal cord would be on an afferent nerve. Anything going out, command to increase your heart rate, a command to move a muscle, command to move your eye. All of that is on this efferent side. Okay. So for our efferent nerves, our next division is going to be between our somatic and our autonomic parts of the nervous system. Okay, so somatic versus autonomic. And I'm picking a different color for each split to kind of emphasize those for you. And the way we're going to tell the difference between these two is actually through their effector organs. So I'm going to leave some space for more splits here. But all the way down at the bottom, When we're sending out commands through the efferent part of the nervous system, we have options for where we're sending those commands. So soma is like the body of something. This is going to your skeleton and your skeletal muscle specifically. Skeletal muscle. So, okay. So we're going to notice that what's particularly true about the somatic nervous system is that this is going to be something that's under your control. This is voluntary. So any named muscle, we're getting there through our somatic nervous system. For our autonomic nervous system, this is the involuntary part. Okay, that first. So this is stuff that's happening to maintain homeostasis. You can't just choose not to maintain homeostasis. That would be bad. So this is involuntary. And it's going to be stuff that keeps you alive. Okay. So this is going to be going to your blood vessels to help you maintain blood pressure, for example. So that would be smooth muscle. Going to go to your heart so that you keep your heart rate up, also helping you maintain blood pressure. So cardiac muscle. And the last important place that this is going to go is to your glands. Their glands are going to be secreting hormones and enzymes, helping you maintain your internal state by sending commands in a different way around your body. So glands are going to be important too. Okay. So we're dividing these based on where they go. We're in the somatic nervous system, we're done. Okay. Somatic, no more branches. In the autonomic, we have dual innervation. So you always have both parasympathetic and sympathetic nerves going to the same place pretty much. Okay. So our effector organs are going to be the same, but we've got two sides for this part. Okay. So we're going to have our parasympathetics on one side. And we have our sympathetics on the other side. I've run out of room, but that says sympathetic, just like the end of this. Okay. So the difference between these two, we're going to continue going through. There's going to be a lot of differences. But from a function perspective, right? So from a what are their effects on smooth muscle, on the heart, on the glands? Essentially, the parasympathetics are going to be your rest and digest the branch. Okay, so I'm just going to write rest here. Okay. And the sympathetics are your fight or flight. I'm going to write stress here. We'll talk about a specific stress response. That means something specific sometimes in physiology, but we're going to be a little hand wavy for right now. Okay. Cool. So we have different effects. They're both always going to these same places. We have dual innervation and they're both kind of always on. We just have a dimmer switch where one of them is more in control. So one of them is going to be more active. One of them is going to predominate, but we have this fine-grained ability to have a lot of a stress response or a little by having them both on at once. Okay, so questions about these breakdowns here? Cool. Also going over this again because I know that once when I talked to the nursing faculty, they said that this is something that those of you who are planning to be nursing majors could spend a little more time with. So we're going a bit slow through the autonomics for that reason. Okay. So we talked a little bit about the anatomy of how we would actually get to an effector organ if we're a parasympathetic nerve or a sympathetic nerve last time. We left off by thinking about the neurotransmitters involved. So we're going to have two main neurotransmitters or kind of hormones. We're going to be a little hand wavy between these two concepts right now, okay, that are going to be present in the autonomic nervous system overall. So we're just focusing on those autonomics for now. So just parasympathetic and sympathetic. We'll come back to the somatic parts later on. So we're going to see that we have acetylcholine, which is going to be received by something called cholinergic receptors. Okay, so you can see the roots of that word together, right? The choline and the cholinergic go together. And so we'll have a nerve that spits out acetylcholine, secretes that. And then the next nerve is going to need a receptor to receive that acetylcholine. And then we're going to have norepinephrine and a little bit of epinephrine from the adrenal glands, also associated with the autonomic nervous system. And this is where it's helpful to know that epinephrine and adrenaline are synonymous. Norepinephrine and noradrenaline would also be synonymous, which is where we get the word for the receptor from. So adrenergic receptors would be associated with adrenaline or your adrenal glands, which is where the norepinephrine is coming from. Sometimes, some of it. Okay. So we find these neurotransmitters in different places. So we know that when we're thinking about the nervous system, our typical structure now is going to be between a preganglionic neuron and a postganglionic neuron, right? So preganglionic, it's just like the presynaptic neuron we talked about before, right? So this is going to be our preganglionic, and we have our postganglionic neuron. Post. So before and after the ganglion, which is where we find cell bodies. So we've got two neurons in a chain. Anytime you have a preganglionic neuron, right? So that first one coming out of the central nervous system and going wherever it's going, we know from last time we have options. And that preganglionic neuron is always going to be releasing acetylcholine. In fact, acetylcholine is going to be a neurotransmitter that we see a lot of places. That's also going to be involved in the somatic nervous system. But we can already see that if every preganglionic neuron releases acetylcholine, that means it's going to be the same for both our sympathetic and our parasympathetic branches of the nervous system, of the autonomic nervous system. Okay. So it's for the postganglionic neuron where we're going to have options that are going to depend on which branch we're talking about. Okay. So if you're a parasympathetic neuron, then this is easy. So presympathetic, always acetylcholine. If you're parasympathetic, that postganglionic neuron is still going to release acetylcholine. Right? So that's easy. However, if you're a sympathetic neuron, now we got to change it up. Okay, so we'll still have a preganglionic and a postganglionic cell. Okay, so we still have our two neurons. Okay. But in this case, while our acetylcholine is still in the middle here at that ganglion, right, so at that connection, now that postganglionic cell is going to be releasing usually norepinephrine. Our exception there is if we're the specific type of sympathetic nerve that goes to the adrenal gland to a chromatin cell. That's where we'd have our epinephrine coming from. Okay. All right. So these are our pathways for parasympathetic versus a sympathetic connection. Okay. All right. This means that we're going to have receptors for the appropriate neurotransmitter on the receiving cells as well, right? So I'll put a art at the end for an effector organ, because we've got shared effector organs, right? But this means we need a receiver for acetylcholine here and here, right? So we're always going to need a receptor for acetylcholine here in this ganglion in the middle. For our parasympathetics, we're also going to need a receptor for acetylcholine on our effector organ. But if we're looking at a target of our sympathetic nervous system, we're going to need to be able to sense that we've got some norepinephrine there. They're going to need a new type of receptor. Those are our adrenergic receptors, are going to need to be on the effector organ where we have connections to the sympathetic nerves. The adrenal gland is special, right? So the adrenal gland do want you to associate with the sympathetic branch of the autonomic nervous system, but it's able to release, in addition to that norepinephrine, which is releasing a little bit, the adrenal medulla, that inside of the adrenal gland, is releasing a lot of epinephrine. So epinephrine, same as adrenaline, about 80% of what that adrenal medulla is releasing is epinephrine. Okay, cool. So here we're looking at that diagram, at a diagram of the sympathetic nervous system. I'm not sure I showed you this one before. Okay, but we can see our different pathways, right? So we know that we have 3 options for pathways for our sympathetic nerves, right? So we talked about the fact that we can have a pathway that goes through the sympathetic chain. And I know that this one's the sympathetic chain one because this preganglionic neuron is pretty short, right? So this would be a synapse in the sympathetic chain. Okay. And sympathetic chain and sympathetic trunk are synonymous. So if there's any variation between your slides and your book or what I say out loud, I'm going to try to say it the same way every time, but those are the same thing. So our next choice on this list, right, is that version of the sympathetic neuron that goes all the way into the adrenal medulla, so inside the adrenal gland. And then we've got a chromatin cell here. And then our third option, I can tell this is the third option because we've got a longer preganglionic neuron. So this is less common, but this would be a collateral ganglion here. Okay, so that's just a ganglion that is not in that sympathetic chain. Okay. All right. So what we're looking at and focusing on here is the neurotransmitters and the receptors. Okay. So here we can see that in each of these diagrams, we have acetylcholine released into that middle synapse, right? So in the ganglion or in the adrenal medulla or here in the collateral ganglion. Okay, so always acetylcholine here in the middle, which means that we would refer to these neurons as cholinergic. So ergic tells you that it's associated with that acetylcholine. When we see adrenergic, that's going to tell you it's associated with adrenaline or noradrenaline, which is norepinephrine. Okay. So a cholinergic neuron, if I say a cholinergic neuron, that's one that releases acetylcholine, which is always going to be true of our preganglionic neurons, right? So in each of these, you can see that these neurons are labeled as cholinergic. That means each of them releases acetylcholine. Okay. However, our postganglionic neurons here are adrenergic, right? So they're releasing norepinephrine, okay? Norepinephrine, okay? So adrenergic neurons for our postganglionic neurons. And we're going to distinguish what's going on, what label we put on the neuron. So cholinergic neuron for our preganglionic neuron here versus our cholinergic receptor is on that postganglionic neuron that ultimately releases acetylcholine. So what I'm telling you is be careful. The word for the neuron itself is telling you what it's releasing. That may not be the same as what it's receiving, right? So each of these postganglionic neurons, while they're adrenergic themselves because they release they release epinephrine or norepinephrine, okay? They have on their cell body, right, on the soma of the neuron here, in the synapse, in the ganglion, they have cholinergic receptors because they're receiving the acetylcholine from that preganglionic neuron. Specifically, we're going to see that there are two types of cholinergic receptors. So we can notice right now that these are going to be the nicotinic cholinergic receptors. We'll have two types. Okay. So nicotinic cholinergic receptors are located on the cell body and potentially the dendrites of those postganglionic neurons in the sympathetic nervous system. So it's not until we get to the effector organs that we'll see our adrenergic receptors, which receive norepinephrine or epinephrine. Gotta make sure that I keep consistent terminology here too. So compared to the parasympathetic nervous system, we've just got the one route, right? So in our parasympathetic nervous system, we know that we've got long preganglionic neurons, almost all the way to the organs, right? So usually our parasympathetic neuron is the vagus nerve. For most of our body, that's what's taking us the parasympathetic innervation. That's cholinergic, releasing acetylcholine. Okay. The postganglionic neuron is also cholinergic, so it is also releasing acetylcholine. Okay. And we have cholinergic receptors to receive that acetylcholine both on our postganglionic neuron on the soma. Right, so we're receiving acetylcholine here on that postganglionic neuron in the synapse. You can see that just like in the sympathetic nervous system, this is a nicotinic cholinergic receptor. And this actually is associated with nicotine. That's one of the ways they found it. Okay. Versus here on our effector organ, this is where we see our other type of cholinergic receptor. So we're still releasing acetylcholine from that postganglionic neuron. But if you're a smooth muscle cell or a heart muscle cell or a gland, you're going to have a different type of receptor here, most likely. These are going to be our muscarinic cholinergic receptors. So before we get into the types, does anybody have any questions here about who's releasing what? Okay, great. Case, I'm going to ask you a couple questions, so go ahead and join. A series of them. Numbers holding still. Okay, cool. All right. So we're going to start out by identifying what neurotransmitter a parasympathetic preganglionic neuron would release. Okay. Cool. Yes, it is acetylcholine. So preganglionic neuron in the parasympathetic branch of the nervous system releases acetylcholine. Okay. All right. So what type of neurotransmitter is that parasympathetic postganglionic neuron going to have receptors for? What are we receiving? Okay. So logically, that preganglionic neuron is releasing acetylcholine. Our postganglionic neuron has to catch that acetylcholine, right? So we've got to receive acetylcholine as well on that postganglionic side. Because that synapse is happening in the ganglion between the preganglionic neuron and the postganglionic neuron. So we've only really got that one neurotransmitter in there just yet. Let's switch to the sympathetic side. Okay, so for our preganglionic sympathetic neuron, what are we releasing? Okay. It is still acetylcholine. Okay, so anytime I ask you what a preganglionic neuron is releasing in our autonomic nervous system is always acetylcholine, whether we have parasympathetic or sympathetic nerve cells. So that communication between the two neurons is always happening with acetylcholine. Okay. So sympathetic preganglionic neurons are still releasing acetylcholine. So what is the postganglionic neuron going to need receptors for? So this is still acetylcholine. So what I'm trying to emphasize to you here is that acetylcholine is doing a ton of stuff, but I'm also trying to step you through how you can think about it, right? So I always like to think in pictures, as you guys are probably aware, right? But whenever we're thinking about a neuron releasing something, right? So the preganglionic neurons are always releasing acetylcholine, okay? We are just playing catch between neurons, right? So in the synapse, our presynaptic neuron released a neurotransmitter, our postsynaptic neuron had a receptor and caught that neurotransmitter. Same thing is still happening out in our peripheral nervous system, right? So we always need some receptor to catch that acetylcholine here in the middle, right? Oops, probably should put it on the cell. Yeah, okay. So we always need a receptor for the thing we had released. Otherwise, there was no point in releasing it in the first place. So all of these are acetylcholine. And it's not until we get to the effector organs that we're going to see receptors of other types for other stuff. Questions about that process? Because I'm not sure if you guys thought I was tricking you as we got to the end or if we have confusion. Hopefully it's just that you didn't want to answer acetylcholine more than but it was all about acetylcholine. So we're going to talk about the cholinergic receptors. Okay. So for our cholinergic receptors, we got two types. They're both receiving acetylcholine. That's the same between them. Okay. The difference is how they do it. So in a nicotinic cholinergic receptor, what we're going to be doing is we're immediately going to be opening some channels for cation. So specifically, we're going to be causing depolarization with these nicotinic cholinergic receptors, because the point is to get the next neurons to fire, basically. So when we open these channels, we're probably thinking sodium channels, we're causing depolarization, we're causing that postganglionic neuron to fire off its own action potential. So this is really important for communicating between our preganglionic and our postganglionic neuron. We want that whole series to fire to get to the effector organ. For our muscarinic cholinergic receptors, it's going to be like our metabotropic receptors in the last unit. So our muscarinic cholinergic receptors are located on effector organs, specifically effector organs for the parasympathetic nervous system. And so you'd have a muscarinic cholinergic receptor on the heart, on your pancreas, on a blood vessel, okay? So these ones are going to be G protein coupled, like our metabotropic receptors in our last unit. And that's helpful for us because this means that we can do different things in the effector organs, right? So the nicotinic cholinergic receptors just immediately opened a cation channel, resulting in depolarization. They kind of have that one function here. Versus when we couple this to a G protein and then potentially to some secondary messengers inside the cell, we can do a variety of different things. So we've got more options. So when we're looking at those locations for those receptors, if we are looking at the autonomics, any postganglionic neuron, be it parasympathetic or sympathetic, is going to have a receptor for acetylcholine, needs it because that's what it's receiving from our preganglionic neuron. That's always going to be a nicotinic cholinergic receptor because we want to fire off an action potential by letting cations in. Same thing is going to be true for our somatic nervous system when we get there and talk about skeletal muscle. We want skeletal muscle to contract when you send it a signal. What else would you want it to do, right? Like if you think about moving your arm, you want your muscles to contract and move. So we'll see those same receptor types again when we get to the somatic nervous system. And it's when we get to the parasympathetic effector organs that we have those muscarinic cholinergic types. Okay. A weird exception to all of the stuff that we're talking about are sweat glands. We're not going to talk about them ever again, but they do happen to have some weird stuff going on where they have muscarinic cholinergic receptors on them, even though they're associated in part with the sympathetics. Okay. So we're not coming back to that, but it happens to be true, so I'm telling you. Okay. So the question leading us into this next little bit, want to remind me what branch of the nervous system is innervating the adrenal medulla, so that inside part of the adrenal gland. And then what are we releasing from that adrenal medulla? All right, take a couple more seconds so we can keep going. And then let's take a look. Okay, yeah, so it's the sympathetic nerves that go to your adrenal glands. The sympathetic nerves going to your adrenal glands. They sit on top of your kidneys. They look like little triangular blobs of fat, but they're really important because they produce a bunch of hormones, essentially. Okay. So they're going all the way to the inside. That's the medulla part. They're sympathetic. That's where we have those chromaffin cells. And they mostly release epinephrine, as well as a little bit of norepinephrine, tiny bit of dopamine there. The reason we're talking about that, that's a reminder that postganglionic neurons from the sympathetic nervous system are doing different stuff. So if we're going through the sympathetic chain, your typical postganglionic neuron releases norepinephrine. Same thing if you go to the collateral ganglion. If we go to the adrenal gland, we're going to have a little more variation. Most of what you'll be releasing is epinephrine, as well a little bit of the norepinephrine that we see in other parts of the postganglionic sympathetic branches of the system. So there are a lot more options for adrenergic receptors than there were for cholinergic. So cholinergic, we just had our fast-acting nicotinic cholinergic receptors that just basically let sodium ions in. I'll be a little hand wavy. Right, so those are like our ionotropic receptors were when we were talking about the synapse. For the endpoints, the effector organs for the parasympathetics, we had some muscarinic cholinergic receptors that are linked to G proteins, but they're like the metabotropic receptors we talked about last time. So we've got a little more variation about what's going on inside the cell because we're linking up with other cellular systems. For adrenergic receptors, we got 5 kinds. Okay. So all of our adrenergic receptors are going to be located on our effector organs, right? So our postganglionic neurons in the sympathetic nervous system are adrenergic, meaning they release norepinephrine or epinephrine. Our adrenergic receptors are on the organs themselves that are receiving that norepinephrine, probably, and a little bit of epinephrine. Okay. All of them are coupled to G proteins, right? We don't have any that are just directly linked to ion channels. So you'd associate them in your mind with that picture we had in the synapse of our metabotropic receptors. So they're all going to do some complicated stuff on the inside. So our first way of categorizing these, we're going to separate out our alpha receptors and our beta receptors. I am going to ask you by the end of this unit to be able to identify what type of receptor I'm talking about if I give you a full description of it. So I'm going to be stepping you through how I would think about it, how I would make that decision. So we're going to start by thinking about alpha versus beta. There are going to be 2 types of alpha receptors and 3 types of beta receptors. So this is a table from your book. I think you have it in one place in your slides, but it's table 11.1 in your textbook. I do recommend spending some time with it, right? This would be a good table to practice filling in yourself or to make some flashcards from. And so what I'm going to highlight for us first are differences between alpha and beta receptors. So alpha are these 2 up top. Beta are these 3 down here. So what we're going to notice about these alpha receptors versus our beta receptors, right? But every time we see a beta receptor, this 4th column is the same. Every single beta receptor activates cyclic AMP, abbreviated AMP. That's a second messenger system inside the cell. So they're all going to be helping your cell make cyclic AMP that then goes off and tells the cell to do stuff. Okay. So that's going to be true of beta receptors. None of your alpha receptors are going to do that, right? So for the alpha receptors, if we do anything other than activating cyclic AMP, that's an alpha receptor. Okay. So for what's happening inside the cell, either an alpha-1 receptor is going to activate a different second messenger, which is IP3, or we might involve that cyclic AMP system, but instead of making cyclic AMP, we're going to stop making cyclic AMP. So if you see cyclic AMP somewhere, you want to be careful to check whether you're activating it, making more of it, or whether you're canceling it out, whether you're inhibiting it. Because if you're inhibiting it, you'd be an alpha receptor, specifically an alpha-2 receptor. Okay. For both of these alpha receptors, you're going to see that they prefer norepinephrine to epinephrine. Right, so our adrenergic receptors are going to be able to respond to either the norepinephrine coming from our postganglionic sympathetic neurons or to the epinephrine from the adrenal gland. But they're going to like one better. potentially, depending on what type of receptor we are. So for the alpha receptors, they like the norepinephrine better, right? So they're going to pick norepinephrine over epinephrine. So they're going to be responding more to those other types of postganglionic sympathetic neurons and a little bit less to those molecules coming out of the adrenal gland. When we look at the beta receptors, we got some variation, but you'll notice none of these beta receptors prefer norepinephrine. Right? Some of them don't care. Beta 1 and beta 3 receptors don't care which of these neurotransmitters you have, but none of them prefer them. So combo of not activating cyclic AMP and preferring norepinephrine is going to tell you you've got some type of alpha receptor. Anytime you see activating cyclic AMP, for sure you've got a beta receptor. Okay. So for our alpha adrenergic receptors, those first two types, alpha 1 and alpha 2, we're going to be somewhere in an effector organ for the sympathetic nervous system. The only place it makes sense to put one because it's only those postganglionic sympathetic neurons that are releasing the norepinephrine. Alpha adrenergic receptors are more common than the beta. Okay? So this is what you see most places out in your body. This will come back into play eventually. We'll think about what effect that has on the blood in AMP2. Usually these are excitatory. So if you look at that table, you can see that sometimes we're going to have excitatory effects on the organ. Sometimes, occasionally, we'll have an inhibitory effect on the effector organ. That's a generalization, but usually we're exciting the cell that we're linking up to, making it more likely to do something. And all of our adrenergic receptors are going to prefer norepinephrine. So here we have a picture. Yeah. Okay. So what we're looking at here, all right, all our adrenergic receptors are G protein coupled. So that's what we see here. Okay. Here we see our norepinephrine or epinephrine coming in. If we're an alpha receptor, which is what we're looking at here, we prefer norepinephrine. But if we have tons and tons of epinephrine circling around, maybe we'd have an effect. Here we can see that G protein heading off to an enzyme and doing some stuff in the cell. So specifically what we're looking at here, part of that some stuff is the secondary messenger IP3. And we can see that that links up with a flow of protein kinases and phosphorylates some proteins. It also links up with your endoplasmic reticulum. It's telling various organelles in your cell to do various different jobs. So that would be an alpha 1 receptor because we can see that IP3 there. On this next diagram, we're going to take a look at both an alpha 2 receptor and our beta receptors. Okay. So for our beta receptors, they're still receiving epinephrine and norepinephrine. All of them activate cyclic AMP. And whether they prefer epinephrine or don't care whether you have epinephrine or norepinephrine is going to depend on what type you're looking at. Okay. So our beta receptor, generic beta receptor 1, 2, or 3, here we have our epinephrine or norepinephrine coming in. It's a G protein coupled receptor because all of our adrenergic receptors are. And here on this diagram, you want to key in on this plus sign. So this plus sign is indicating to you that this is activating this cyclic AMP, which then does stuff. Okay. I'm pointing that out because the alpha 2 receptor is on the other side. Okay. So it's behaving the same, but the difference is that it has an inhibitory effect on the cyclic AMP production. So it would be like turning this off. And so even though it interacts with the cyclic AMP, it's doing the opposite action, which is how we can tell it's an alpha adrenergic receptor. So finally, we're going to notice differences between our beta receptors. Right, so between the beta receptors, one of the things we can focus on to pick out one from all the others is we can notice that one of our beta receptors really, really, really likes epinephrine. Okay. So if you see a beta receptor that really likes epinephrine, it's a beta 3 receptor. For our beta 1 versus beta 3, they both have an equivalent responsiveness and equivalent affinity for norepinephrine and epinephrine. So that doesn't really help you tell those two apart. What I would look for if you want to tell beta 1 and beta 3 receptors apart is where they are. And specifically, if I describe a receptor, probably more likely to be a beta 1 than a beta 3, because the beta 3 receptors are just found in fat. So the only place you'll find a beta 3 receptor is in adipose tissue in fat. If it's anywhere else and it has an equivalent responsiveness to norepinephrine and epinephrine, we can tell it's a beta receptor because it's activating cyclic AMP as a beta 1. Okay. All right. This is written out here. So this is just writing the table out in words. Beta 1 receptors, you see them in the cardiac muscle and the kidneys. They're usually excitatory, which most of our receptors were. They don't care if you have norepinephrine or epinephrine, they like them both. Beta 2 receptors have a greater affinity for epinephrine, so that's a marker. Another thing is that these are the ones in the table that are inhibitory, the only ones, so that's another thing you could be keying in on. And then the beta 3 receptors, specifically, I think the thing that points them out above all the others is that they're going to adipose tissue. Otherwise, they look kind of like the beta 1 receptors. Okay. I was just making sure that you see that in words as well, because there will be a question about this on your quiz that is up for the weekend to do by Monday. So we'll break there. Sure. Before the last one, so this one. Here was this one. This is everything about. Oh, let me turn off the Zoom so people aren't spying on us.